Hey everybody, this is Chapter 9 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein, translated by Adam Baltner. Chapter 9 is titled The Curse of Writing Today. It starts with a quote. 99% of the readership wants not to have a copy of reality, but rather to partake in a perfectly formed celebration in honor of an existential stability, which does not exist. End quote. Arno Schmidt, from a piece titled, quote, Fünfzen, end quote, vom Wunderkind der Sinnlosigkeit. Alright, here we are, Section 1. Everything is quite simple. The problems of linguistic mediation between theory and practice confront Adorno and Horkheimer in three illustrative groups of conversations from 1939, 1945, and 1956, respectively. Each one revolves around the topic of a manifesto the two intended to write. The first of these groups of conversations, titled, quote, Diskussionen über Sprache und Erkenntnis, Naturbeherrschung am Menschen, politische Aspekte des Marxismus, or, in English, which I actually know how to speak, discussions on language and knowledge, domination of nature and humans, political aspects of Marxism, by editor Gunselin Schmid-Neuer, took place in the fall of 1939. Already, it concerns, quote, the political perspective of critical theory in view of the National Socialist War, with the interlocutors of immediately thematizing the cultural and political hindrances to what they take to be the obvious goal of proletarian revolution, end quote. Schmid-Neuer. Quote, Horkheimer, this is Horkheimer, quote, the German proletarians are tasked with toppling their government, ... The task of all proletarians is to eliminate the impediments standing in the way of a rational ordering of the world, ... These things are really quite simple. One ought to say, quote, over the last 20 years it's been drilled into that the world is not ready for socialism, yet you didn't want to believe this in 1918, and it's even less true today, end quote. The time is now, or in 100 years, end quote. Horkheimer. Adorno, quote, so you're of the opinion that existing relations of political power shouldn't factor into setting political goals, end quote. Horkheimer, quote, revolution always appears completely impossible and insane until revolution happens, ... Bearing in mind the aforementioned complexity, I just meant that what the proletariat ought to do is extremely simple to describe. The perspective is that if the world weren't struck by blindness, the proletariat could put things in order immediately, end quote. Horkheimer. Adorno is apparently interested in a theory which would reflect experience, presumed to be general, in such a way that its account would be resoundingly evident. To Adorno, enlightenment is in order not concerning the, quote, wholly enlightened, end quote, earth, but rather the practical consequences stemming from the knowledge thereof. The result of knowledge should be to indicate a pending triumph over prevailing circumstances. Adorno, quote, the individual insights must not be blind. In the theory, each must be equally close to the midpoint, end quote. Adorno. Horkheimer, quote, so like in the Communist Manifesto, the sentences capture experiences. We should try to write a text with those tendencies, end quote. Horkheimer. 1 week later, Adorno and Horkheimer attempted to, quote, establish individual points for the schema of the, quote, manifesto, end quote, end quote. The 14 points they lay out include the stipulation that, quote, every single sentence, end quote, of the manifesto should, quote, articulate something which everyone has already thought himself, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Footnote. These points are as follows. Quote, 1. Actuality of Marxism. 2. Orientation in this situation. 3. Every single sentence must articulate something which everyone has already thought himself. 4. The knowledge of complex individual relationships is one of the most important tricks used to sabotage real insight. 5. The political situation. 6. The question of political theory, together with certain philosophical things, questions of culture and science. 8. The political program. 9. Critique of the proletariat. 10. Anthropology. 11. Concept of reason. 2. What extent happiness can no longer exist in this society, and to what extent the image of happiness is distorted by its orientation on this society. 13. Socialism and administration. 12. Socialism and domination of nature, end quote. Some of these numbers are out of order here. End footnote. Adorno reiterates Horkheimer's notion that what needs to be said is simple. Quote, basically, everyone has to know that the world today is hell, end quote. Adorno. And it is this knowledge to which Adorno and Horkheimer seek to appeal. Adorno, quote, additionally, every sentence must break through the facade, end quote. Adorno. Horkheimer, quote, isn't opacity a facade, end quote. Horkheimer. Adorno, quote, the whole thing has to have a tenor of, quote, fear-mongering is invalid, end quote, Adorno. Horkheimer, quote, basically things today are simpler than under liberalism, end quote. Horkheimer. Adorno, quote, the complexity is just a veil to conceal the simplicity, end quote. Adorno. The last of the Diskussionen über Sprache und Erkenntnis, held in November 1939, returns to the question of, quote, a possible beginning of the, quote, manifesto, end quote, end quote. Adorno establishes their position as follows, quote, everyone says that Marxism is finished. We reject this. Not only is Marxism not finished, the point is to stay faithful to it, end quote. Adorno. At the moment of Marxism's demise, so to speak, for, quote, to really stay faithful is to further advance the dialectical process, end quote. Adorno. Moreover, Adorno once again emphasizes, quote, that in reality everything is quite simple. Basically, everyone knows how it is, but no one wants to say it. So first, Marxism, fidelity. Solidarity as fidelity to theory, synonymous with the particular transformation preordained by matters. Then political analysis with a double aspect, both Marxist and a blow to the face of political and theoretical stabilizations, end quote. Adorno. Horkheimer replies that the issue is, quote, not simplicity but opacity, end quote. Horkheimer. To Horkheimer, an opacity mystifying the evident nature of simple matters is what the manifesto has to overcome. Quote, liberating knowledge is only separated from human beings by a thin partition, end quote. Horkheimer. As would be made clear in Dialectic of Enlightenment, this, quote, partition, end quote, is taken to be a function of culture. Yet already in the discussion, Adorno voices his suspicion that the reasons for revolution's absence are located, quote, in the cultural sphere, end quote, arguing that, quote, culture is absorbed into advertising, end quote. Adorno. At the conclusion of the discussion, Adorno poses the question of whether experience, quote, given that it yields no happiness, points back to the capitalist process of labor, end quote. Adorno, and refers to a quote fun theory, end quote. Adorno, which although no longer mentioned would later be condensed into the thesis that quote fun is a medicinal bath, end quote, in the culture industry chapter of Dialectic of Enlightenment. Footnote: the English word quote fun is used in the German original here and in the following quotations. End footnote. Horkheimer answers with resignation, quote, the entire labor movement which fights for fun has become base. End quote. Dialectic of Enlightenment. End quote, Horkheimer. New section, section 2. That quite interesting critique by H&A. The state of the world in 1945 was fundamentally different from when these discussions had taken place. Unable to compel itself to overthrow its government, the German proletariat had instead put its service towards honoring the Führer, the Volk, and the Vaterland. Meanwhile, fascism had not left language unscathed. In the words of Adorno and Horkheimer, quote, today language calculates, designates, betrays, initiates death. It does not express, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. In a summary of a conversation between Adorno and Horkheimer from 1945, conversation between Adorno and Horkheimer from 1945 illustrates Adorno and Horkheimer's shared resignation in view of the difficulties facing the public mediation of critical theory's insights. Quote, if we criticize psychoanalysis today and call for incest, Herr Shapiro will say to Herr Cohn, have you already read that quite interesting critique by H&A, end quote. Footnote. Adorno, quote, the chance conversation in the train, when to avoid dispute, one consents to a few statements that one knows ultimately to implicate murder, is already a betrayal. No thought is immune against communication, and to utter it in the wrong place and in wrong agreement is enough to undermine its truth, end quote. End footnote. Footnote. Quote, Herr Shapiro refers to Marxist art historian Meyer Shapiro, who, at the time, taught at Columbia University and was in contact with Adorno and Horkheimer. Quote, Herr Cohn may refer to Elliot E. Cohen, the publisher of Commentary magazine, upon its establishment by the American Jewish Committee in 1945, and someone else with whom Adorno and Horkheimer maintained contact. End footnote. In contrast to their own situation, Adorno and Horkheimer believe that if the Communist Manifesto could have counted on making an impact in its own time, this was because the Communist Manifesto was able to address itself to a, quote, unintegrated society, end quote, in which the proletariat, quote, was not yet completely, quote, on the inside, end quote, end quote. Insofar as the proletariat, quote, has no stake in society's humanity, it is all the better off in its own dehumanization, end quote. With the apparent disappearance of a proletariat which still saw itself as dominated by an external force, all theory became obsolete, which regarded itself as able to appeal in an immediate and enlightened manner to an addressee with a practical interest in changing what exists. Quote, the curse of writing today is that, however it turns out, it no longer rouses anyone anymore. The Communist Manifesto still set something in motion, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Adorno and Horkheimer now see themselves confronted with antinomies relating not only to the philosophy of language, but to society itself. Assisted not least by the culture industry, the integrative force of society is disavowed. The entire appellatory character of linguistic expression in favor of the mere exchange of information. The mediating linguistic relationship between theory and practice has been abrogated by the latter. Quote, "We believe that the relationship of what is written to the world must be consciously included in the theoretical formulation as something co-determinative of the truth of the matter. Yet this relation is suspect to us," end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Adorno and Horkheimer view the relationship between theory and practice as truncated by a practice which only permits statements about what exists. Quote, "No terms are available which do not tend toward complicity with the prevailing intellectual trends," end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. A call for anything at all, even for something like incest, is treated as literature, as something to be judged not according to some standard of truth, but by opinion, if at all. No immediacy to reality can be asserted anymore, even though such immediacy is precisely what a manifesto would need to claim for itself in order to be effective. The theoretical statements not content to list facts degrade objectively into the, quote, non-committal character of a private Weltanschauung, private worldview, end quote. Adorno. Instead of being approached as interventions which deserve to be taken seriously, texts tend to be treated with, quote, indifference or condescension, or at most with irony, end quote. Willemsen, 1999. By their recipients, who prefer to maintain their distance where judgment would be in order. Meanwhile, what texts themselves say comes to stand in for judgment, with the author being seen as already having made and communicated a judgment. When language itself is, quote, taken as a plot, as communication, parenthesis, Mitteilung, in parenthesis, end quote. In this way, it loses its appellatory character, quote, how one gives something else and acts. Quote, how one gives someone else an acts, shares and acts with that person. Parenthesis, einer axt mit teilt, end parenthesis. So that he can fell a tree is also how one gives someone else a formula to wipe out the entire forest. The criterion of the deed becomes the criterion of the thought, the expedience, the effect, end quote. Footnote. Translator's note. The original German passage involves a play on words with root words which mean, quote, with, mit, and, quote, sharing, Teilung. The German word for message, Mitteilung, can be read as, quote, sharing with, end quote. End footnote. Footnote. Letter from Horkheimer, 12th of May, Horkheimer to Adorno, 12th of May, 1945. In his response to this letter, Adorno writes of his, quote, unbridled excitement that we will soon return these things, end quote. One of these, quote, things would have been the conversation about the manifesto. End footnote. As Adorno and Horkheimer conclude, quote, the only way forward we now see and upon which we will not backslide behind Marx is to take up Marx's categories. In this we currently have in mind concepts such as class and labor. With class we are envisioning a critique which has as its subject class's absorption into rackets. In a strict sense, perhaps no class has ever existed. End quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Here, class is used not in the objective sense of the critique of political economy, but rather as a synonym for the class consciousness of the proletariat. Although proletarians, of course, exist, Horkheimer and Adorno see themselves confronted with the question of whether, quote, the proletariat, end quote, can be said to exist in a strong sense, the very question which Lukács enthusiastically answered in the affirmative more than 20 years prior. In arriving at their own answer, Horkheimer and Adorno turned to the concept of labor. As Horkheimer and Adorno explain, quote, the process of demythologization, which we described in Dialectic of Enlightenment, should be developed from the concept of labor. Enlightenment means the decoupling of labor from labor's substance. The process is essentially mediated through trade unions. They detach the worker from the worker's objective interests. The point is to reveal the dialectic of this process and hence of the labor union and the concept of the proletariat, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Footnote. Here as well, trade unions are discussed as a hindrance to class consciousness. In his earlier article, Reflections on Class Theory, Adorno writes that trade unions have become, quote, monopolies and their officials, bandits, end quote. For the, quote, division between leader and led to be found in the ruling class reproduces itself compulsively, end quote, in the proletariat. Adorno. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno draw from this the following conclusion, quote, even for a union boss, to say nothing of a manager, a proletarian is no more than a superfluous specimen. Should he catch his notice at all, while the union boss in turn must live in terror of his own liquidation, end quote. Dialectic of Enlightenment. End footnote. Domination, the principle undergirding the entirety of society, also asserts itself within the latter's individual spheres. Staying faithful to, quote, Reflections on Class Theory, or to the article Reflections on Class Theory, Horkheimer and Adorno note that the proletariat has become subordinated to the proletariat's own command as well, that domination by others has become domination by the self, and just as in Adorno's Reflections, quote, gangs, and rackets, end quote, even those aligned with the labor movement are said to function as mediators of this domination. Quote, as reluctant as we are to do so, we should, probably broach a critique of international organizations. As squalid, bloated rackets, they are the caricature of what could be. Already viable in them are the collective interests of the bureaus of various national rackets, end quote. Footnote. The summary of Adorno and Horkheimer's discussion continues as follows, quote, we are not sure whether the assumption of Marxian categories today vouches for the inner actuality of our theoretical achievement. Yet it appears for the time being to continue to drive the movement, almost like an attack on the repressive role of those rackets, religious, political, military, industrial, and trade union, which superficially conflict with but actually agree with each other. At the same time, it must be kept in mind above all that while the attack will refer to the national rackets, substantively it must be kept current. It must keep current the transposition of the class relation onto the international scene. In an age of transition from the national class relation to the oppression of peoples by peoples, the leaders of peoples and all gangsters of the world join together under the star of fame into an international union. One example of an exponent of this union is Harold Lasky, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Lasky was the leader of the British Labour Party at the time, and he was of the far left of it, also a Zionist. Where am I? Adorno and Horkheimer observed that, quote, the increasing integration of society has made the concept of nonconformism problematic in the sense that no theoretical and hardly any practical utterance can be imagined anymore which is not in one form or another yet caught in the mesh of the system, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Thus, Adorno and Horkheimer feel compelled to, quote, develop alternative forms of resistance to those which presuppose something transcendent to society, such as still existed in the time of Marx among the poor who were pressed into factories. Instead, resistance today is a matter of bringing into self-consciousness those countervailing tendencies, parenthesis, Tendenzen zum Umschlag, which are maturing within integrated society itself, helping them to their reversal, ihrem Umschlag zu helfen. Quote, when taken together with the human beings, radical self-alienation, and hence with the absolutely negative, the process of the radical alienation of labor brought about by the extreme domination of nature also portends a, quote, almost utopia, end quote, at the same time. The fully reified society is infinitely close to the concept of humanity. The ant colony is a projection of those who prepare it, yet repress it from consciousness. Its conscious realization could coincide with its abolition, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Here Adorno and Horkheimer follow, in quote, that tradition of enlightenment which reaches from Homeric myth to Hegel and Marx, in whom the spontaneous deed, the act of freedom, coincides with the culmination of the objective trend, end quote. Adorno. This tradition is present in the notion that society, conceived of as, quote, infinitely close to the concept of humanity, end quote, shall navigate through the, quote, absolute negative, end quote, to find refuge within the absolutely negative, with theory helping society, which already produces its own, quote, countervailing tendencies, end quote, to its own reversal. Footnote, the Communist Manifesto also ultimately claims that the bourgeoisie produces above all, quote, its own gravediggers, its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable, end quote. Marx and Engels. Yet this theory, which wants to help transcend what exists, contains the same dialectic recognized by Adorno and Minima Moralia as existing within Marxian theory, namely the dialectic which maintains, quote, that the proletariat as the absolute object of history is capable of becoming its first social subject and realizing the conscious self-determination of mankind, end quote. Adorno, quote, negative philosophy, dissolving everything, dissolves even the dissolvent. But the new form in which it claims to suspend and preserve both dissolved and dissolvent can never emerge in a pure state from an antagonistic society. As long as domination reproduces domination's self, the old quality reappears unrefined in the dissolving of the dissolvent. In a radical sense, no leap is made at all. What would happen only with the liberating, that would happen only with the liberating event. Because the dialectical determination of the new quality always finds itself referred back to the violence of the objective tendency that propagates domination, it is placed under the almost inescapable compulsion, whenever it has conceptually achieved the negation of the negation, to substitute, even in thought, the bad old order for the non-existent alternative. The depth to which it penetrates objectivity is bought with complicity in the lie that objectivity is truth, by strictly limiting itself to extrapolating the image of a privilege-free state from that which owes to the historical process the privilege of existing. It bows to restoration. This is registered by private existence, end quote. Adorno. For the intellectual, fleeing from this privilege would simultaneously mean the betrayal of theory. Adorno and Horkheimer saw themselves tasked with theorizing the contingent luxury of the possibility of theoretical practice, or in other words, the privilege which, following the, quote, separation of mental and manual labor, ... reserves mental labor, ... despite all assertions to the contrary, ... the easier, bracket, form of labor, and bracket, for itself, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Adorno writes about intellectuals, that is, about himself, in two similar passages in Minima Moralia, quote, in still permitting themselves to think at all in the face of the naked reproduction of existence, they act as a privileged group. In letting matters rest there, they declare the nullity of their privilege. Private existence, in striving to resemble one worthy of man, betrays the latter, since any resemblance is withdrawn from general realization, which yet more than ever before has need of independent thought. There is no way out of entanglement. The only responsible course is to deny oneself the ideological misuse of one's own existence, and for the rest to conduct oneself in private as modestly, unobtrusively, and unpretentiously as is required, no longer by good upbringing, but by the shame of still having air to breathe in hell, end quote. Adorno. Quote, intellectual business is helped by the isolation of intellect from business to become a comfortable ideology. This dilemma is communicated to intellectual behavior even in its subtlest reactions. Only someone who keeps himself in some measure pure has hatred, nerves, freedom, and mobility enough to oppose the world, but just because of the illusion of purity, for he lives as a, quote, third person, end quote, he allows the world to triumph not merely externally, but in his innermost thoughts, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Quote, our predicament has a dual nature. We don't simply want to become third persons again. This doesn't mean that we have something against the, quote, parasitic. On the contrary, freedom from the coercion of production within degenerated bourgeois society was accompanied precisely by the survival of autonomy. Yet following the Marxian era, one can no longer seek to amuse the bourgeoisie as a third person, be it through critique or glorification. We have to be clear about this, even while we certainly know that for us, intellectual pursuit is still the natural mode of existence for the sons of rich parents. Thus, as, quote, philosophers of existence, end quote, we want to reflect on our own existence, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Here, the term, quote, third person, end quote, refers to those who, quote, live on profit that has been diverted to them, end quote. Or in Marx's words, to those members of that, quote, idle surplus population, end quote, which, quote, does not work, end quote. People described by Adorno and Horkheimer as, quote, the, quote, parasitic, end quote, insofar as they stand outside the economic process of reproduction, intellectuals. As Adorno writes in his 1960 essay, Valerie's Deviations, quote, while, bracket, third persons, end bracket, perform no, quote, socially useful work, end quote, and contribute nothing to the material reproduction of life, it is these third persons alone who represent theory and all consciousness that points beyond the blind coercion of material circumstances. They are defenseless against the distrust both of the status quo, which they live on without serving it dependably, and its enemies, for whom they are nothing but impotent agents of power, end quote. From this insight, Adorno draws the same conclusion from 15 years prior. If one is to defend third persons, quote, it cannot be by praising the mind abstractly, but only by expressing the negative element in them as well. Only when the ideological husk of their own existence falls away, only in a process of merciless self-reflection that would be the self-reflection of society as well, would they attain their social truth, end quote. Adorno. Later in their conversation from 1945, Adorno and Horkheimer turned their considerations towards, quote, the right state of humanity which would already be possible today, end quote, arguing that Marx, quote, essentially defined this state with the concept of leisure, end quote, inasmuch as leisure, quote, stands for the, quote, true realm of freedom, the development of human powers as an end in itself, end quote, end quote. Schurman, 2003, with a quote from Marx. In Theories of Surplus Value, Marx describes, quote, real wealth, end quote, as time which is not, quote, absorbed in direct productive labor, end quote, but instead, quote, available for enjoyment, for leisure, thus giving scope for free activity and development, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Originally published by Karl Kautsky between 1905 and 1910, the collection of Marx's writings known as Theories of Surplus Value can now be found in English in Marx Engels Collected Works, volumes 30 to 32. End footnote. Adorno and Horkheimer seek to, quote, draw on, end quote, this conception of leisure, which they see as, quote, deeply connected with that of the third person, end quote. Insofar as Marx conceives of, quote, third persons, end quote, those, quote, idlers whose business is to consume alien products, end quote. Marx, as people who are capable of leading the very life which should exist as a utopia for all. Adorno and Horkheimer claim that, quote, under monopoly capitalism, end quote, the concept of leisure changed as fundamentally as the concept of the individual itself, understood as someone who is still able to partake in leisure after monopoly capitalism's rise. Quote, the concept of dehumanization is changed in its composition. In Marx's work, it meant non-participation in culture, brutalization, parenthesis, verdiert sein, in parenthesis. Today it amounts to being completely occupied by culture, to the Hegelian identity of the human with its being for itself, being ironically fulfilled by the human's social substance. This development applies to the concept of leisure. Under monopoly capitalism, working hours are indeed already degraded by the total dematerialization of labor. But precisely this disqualification of labor has claimed as a victim what in the Marxian sense makes humans in leisure human. The individual that, following Hegel, can only realize itself within the general social parameters, has realized itself so fundamentally therein that in fact nothing individual is taken seriously anymore, ... Yet this involves the dialectic that the individual, by realizing its substance in the Hegelian sense, forfeits all substance. The parameter of being the chief of police is just as external to the individual as is, in the Hegelian sense, the question of whether it prefers veal or veal or mutton. The less additional work humans have to do, the more they become a mere appendage of the machinery, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Footnote. Adorno, quote, the masses are not primary, but secondary. The masses are an object of calculation, and appendage of the machinery, end quote. Adorno. The, quote, appendage of the machinery, end quote, motif occurs almost verbatim in multiple passages in Adorno's work. End footnote. Not only does this passage recapitulate insights expressed in Minima Moralia, it also revisits the notion from dialectic of enlightenment that contemporary culture forges a, quote, false identity of universal and particular, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Quote, the other difficulty, end quote, with which Adorno and Horkheimer have to contend involves, quote, the concept of practice, the opposite of the fetish spirit, end quote. This difficulty, quote, follows from the state of the labor movement, end quote. For if the labor movement as an entity no longer functions by helping the class consciousness of the proletariat to assert itself, then it is insufficient to simply promote the Communist Party or, quote, to toe the Communist Party line, end quote, as Adorno put it in aesthetic theory. Quote, we do not believe that one should join those for whom the alternatives are being for or against the Communist Party, ... The unconditional acceptance of the alternative itself already contains the acknowledgement that the revolution has failed. On the contrary, we believe that the opposition, that the Communist Party itself above all, belongs to the world which must be overcome by revolution. End quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. However, in their discussion from 1956, Adorno and Horkheimer modified their position on the utility of a revolutionary party again. New section, Section 3, a strictly Leninist manifesto. Adorno and Horkheimer's last surviving series of conversations about writing a manifesto dates from 1956, a discussion on theory and practice in view of the, quote, constellation of the two antagonistic world blocks, end quote. It attempts to chart a course for critical theory, quote, between utopia and politically concrete position-taking, end quote. Schmid-Neuer. When the relationship between labor and free time in both the West and the East is brought up on the 12th of March 1956, Horkheimer expresses the idea that he and Adorno, quote, ought to construct a kind of program for a new form of practice, end quote. Adorno responds by suggesting, quote, the Communist Manifesto as a theme for variations, end quote. Notably, no mention is made of their earlier discussions on the necessity of composing a manifesto. Footnote, at any rate, reflections on previous debates on the topic have not survived, end footnote. Apparently, the idea for a manifesto kept resurfacing during the war years and in the early post-war period, but only to be rejected time and again due to a similar set of problems. Adorno, quote, on the other hand, we must not abandon Marxist terminology, end quote. Horkheimer, quote, we have nothing else, but I am not sure how far we must retain it. Is the political question still relevant at a time when you cannot act politically? Adorno, quote, on the one hand, it is ideology. On the other, all processes that might lead to change are political processes. Politics is both ideology and genuine reality, end quote. Adorno. The notion that politics has become obsolete is already present in a conversation between Adorno and Horkheimer from 11 years prior. Quote, in a certain sense, politics is no longer current, given that it has become clear to everyone what it involves, that what the political goal would be, end quote. Just as Adorno and Horkheimer addressed the evident nature of what is in 1945 a motif of their 1939 conversations as well, so too does this motif recur on the 25th of March 1956, when the idea of composing a manifesto comes up yet again, and yet again spontaneously, as if for the first time. Adorno, quote, shouldn't we really have to think everything out from the beginning, write a manifesto that will do justice to the current situation? In Marx's day, it could not yet be seen that the immanence of society had become total. That means, on the one hand, that one might also need to do no more than strip off the outer shell. On the other hand, that no one really wants things to be otherwise, end quote. Adorno. Horkheimer, quote, we still have something of a breathing space. We must not lose sight of that in our discussion of theory. We cannot be active politically, and yet every word we write is political. We have to say clearly that the Communist Party is not a whit superior to the liberal politicians in the Federal Republic. ... It must become quite clear from our general position why one can be a communist and yet despise the Russians." End quote. Horkheimer. Adorno, quote, "We must be against Adenauer," end quote. Adorno. Horkheimer, quote, "But that is only true as long as we list the reasons that make it possible to keep on living in the West. An appeal for the reestablishment of a socialist party," end quote. Horkheimer. Adorno, quote, "with a strictly Leninist manifesto," end quote. Adorno. Against this, Horkheimer argues that, quote, "we should be told that such a manifesto could not appear in Russia, while in..." Against this, Horkheimer argues that, quote, we would be told that such a manifesto could only appear in Russia, while in the United States and Germany it would be worthless. Sorry, I fucked that up. Against this, Horkheimer argues that, quote, "we would be told that such a manifesto could not appear in Russia, while in the United States and Germany such a manifesto would be worthless. At best, such a manifesto might have some success in France and Italy," end quote. Horkheimer. Hedging himself again, Horkheimer then adds that, quote, "we are not calling on anyone to take action," end quote. Horkheimer. Shortly thereafter, on the 30th of March, in a conversation on the relationship between theory and practice, Adorno clarifies what he envisions under a, quote, "strictly Leninist manifesto," end quote. Quote, "What irritates me so much about the entire relationship between theory and practice is something quite obvious, namely the experience that everything the Russians write slips into ideology, into crude, stupid twaddle. That culture is rubbish, and that somewhere at the very same spot as in Marx and Engels, there is an element of re-barbarization. Thinking in their, bracket, the Russians, and bracket, writings, is more reified than in the most advanced bourgeois thought. I have always wanted to rectify that and develop a theory that remains faithful to Marx, Engels, and Lenin, while keeping up with culture at its most advanced," end quote. Adorno. Horkheimer's surprising and immediately abandoned suggestion to compose a, quote, an appeal for the re-establishment of a socialist party, end quote, is rejected by Adorno, who explicitly does not want to hand over revolutionary theory to a political party. Quote, "Any appeal to form a left-wing socialist party is not on the agenda. Such a party would either be dragged along in the wake of the Communist Party, or it would suffer the fate of the SPD or Labour Party. It is not a political issue that there is no party," end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Regarding the, quote, "fate of the SPD," end quote, Adorno writes Horkheimer in 1966 of his plan, quote, "to write a critique of the Godesberger program," end quote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 8th of December, 1966. In the Godesberger program, the SPD reformed the SPD self into a Volkspartei, or Big Tent Party. While Adorno has started work on this plan, Adorno expresses, quote, "very serious doubts," end quote, as to whether it is, quote, "the right point in time," end quote, for the critique. Quote, "To attack the SPD today, as this work would, however it is put together, is to deliver grist to the mills of everyone who wants to rock the badly damaged democracy, ... I have to admit to you that political instinct has forsaken me. On the one hand, it is apparent that the Grand Coalition entails the danger that the SPD will deprive the SPD's self of a near certain chance of an election victory in 1969, with the result that a right-wing conservative course, a la Franz Josef Strauss, will emerge as the savior from neo-Nazism, even though this course would be quite similar to what it claims to be the savior from. On the other hand, I see in the Grand Coalition the genuine chance for a transition to a two-party system, ... and with that for the exclusion of the neo-Nazi NPD. So please lend me some sage advice, and it would be wonderful if you wouldn't delay too long in doing so," end quote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 8th of December, 1966. Horkheimer discouraged Adorno, who dropped the plan. As a result of the federal election in 1969, a social liberal coalition government was formed under Willy Brandt, who served as Germany's first social democratic chancellor. End footnote. As they again attempt to compose a manifesto in the style of Marx and Engels, the fact that neither Adorno nor Horkheimer reflect upon their previous discussions on the topic, that neither in 1945 nor 1956 do they mention that they already had similar conversations, and that these conversations produced neither a manifesto nor progress in their own insights into the matter. All this indicates a theoretical standstill within critical theory, or at least as practiced by Adorno and Horkheimer between 1939 and 1956, concerning central questions of the critique of political economy. Schmid-Nour's comment that the final group of conversations is also concerned, quote, "not least with what form of writing is appropriate to the present," end quote, can certainly be expanded. In all three groups of conversations, Adorno and Horkheimer veritably slave away at the question of how to write effectively in a time in which, on the one hand, reality is no longer dressed up in ideology but rather exposed for all to see, yet on the other, all texts are received with an apathetic mildness, depriving every appeal of its spur. In a September 1941 letter to Horkheimer, Adorno refers to a note he had written 2 years prior, which in his words, quote, "at least shows how much I am aware of my own helplessness. I admittedly tend towards the view that this is not merely a matter of my failure, but rather also one of a real antinomy," end quote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 4th of September, 1941, end footnote. The note reads as follows, quote, "the prohibitive difficulty of theory today is revealed in language. Language no longer allows anything to be said as it is experienced. Either it is reified, commodity language, a language which is banal and partially falsifies thoughts, or it is fleeing from banality, ceremonial without ceremony, empowered without power, validated by its own account, ... that the violence of facts has become so outrageous that all theory and even true theory makes a mockery of facts. This is burned like a mark into the organ of theory itself, language. The practice which takes away the theory's power emerges as an element of destruction within theory, without regards for potential practice. In fact, nothing more can be said. Action is only the form which remains in theory." Adorno. This is the curse which afflicts writing when, quote, "the objective presuppositions are lacking for such forms as the leaflet or the manifesto," end quote. As Adorno observes they were in 1959, quote, "those who imitate them are often only acting as secret worshippers of power, parading their own impotence," end quote. Adorno. After all, quote, "the notion that through the theory and through the enunciation of the theory one can immediately stir people and rouse them to action has become doubly impossible. This results from the disposition of men who, as is well known, can no longer be aroused by theory in any way, and results from the form of reality which excludes the possibility of such actions, which for Marx seem to be just around the corner. If today one behaved as if one could change the world tomorrow, then one would be a liar," end quote. Adorno, cited in Derendorf, 1976. End footnote. Today, appeals are no longer composed to appeal, but rather to demonstrate that one has composed an appeal. Every text which wants to immediately intervene is now only a documentation of itself. Until further notice, the linguistic mediation between theory and practice addressed at the outset of this chapter no longer exists. If critical theory wants to become a become practical in spite of this, in times in which the mediation between emancipatory theory and practice is socially truncated, then every utterance aiming towards practice is inevitably presents itself solely as a testimony of individual nonconformity, which in turn can be dismissed as quirkiness. The social stupidity which speaks from language is essential to that practice which calls to be changed. If theory is to avoid succumbing to this stupidity, it requires a mode of speaking which is different from the merely communicative. However, this mode of speaking would no longer be understood by the masses to whom manifestos and leaflets are usually addressed, at least not insofar as, quote, understanding, end quote, is understood as a content-related category rather than a cognitive one. At best, the contents of leaflets are perceived as something artificial or artistic, as literature, and at worst as impotent requests to speak issued by irrelevant parties. Either way, they are not understood as suggestions of how life could be better. Here as well, cultural absorption has been completed. Whoever wants to read elaborate social critique in leaflet form is better off looking in the exhibits of specialized museums than on the streets. All that remains is to criticize the social process in its own right, including as it manifests itself in the degeneration of, quote, language as the organon of thought, end quote, Adorno. And that's the end of chapter 9. It's also the end of part 2 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein, edited by Baltner. Thank you so much for listening.